Today we're going to make a beautiful lidded bowl. Hello, I'm Kent and welcome to Turn a Wood Bowl. Today we're going to make a lidded wood bowl. Now what I did several months ago is I had a chunk of cherry, this is side grain cherry, and I started turning a bowl blank with it with the tenon on the bottom, and I decided to go ahead and put a tenon on the top as well. And then I parted the piece about 2/3 of the way through. And this allows plenty of surface area for moisture to release from the bowl blank and allows this to dry or equalize the environment. Now all I have to do is true up these tenons, and then we're going to part this and work on both sides and make a fitted lid for a bowl. And because this is relatively dry right now, it's not going to move much, or hopefully it's not going to move much in the future, so that lid will stay seated well inside the bowl. I'm going to put this end to end in the lathe, and I'm going to true up these tenons, and then we'll get started with the turning.
So I'm going to mount this in the lathe end to end, pulling up the tailstock and tightening that in place. You can see here how the bowl blank has warped dramatically while I was drying. First tool I'll be using is my go-to bowl gouge. This is the 55-degree bevel swept back bowl gouge. This is a 1/2-inch bowl gouge. This is probably used 90% of the time. I'm making a push cut into the headstock to true up this tenon, make it a good cylinder again. And then I'm making a pulling scraping cut with the bottom wing of that. Now I'm going to grab my spindle detail gouge and undercut a dovetail into the tenon that will be used to match up with the chuck, so the chuck has a good firm grip on this tenon once again. I like to undercut that inside corner of that tenon as well. It's better to have it undercut than having any material in that area. You want the tenon to seat really flat. So here I'm checking the diameter of the tenon and comparing to that, make sure I've got enough room in my jaws, which I do. Going back in to take out a little bit of material in that corner. That corner area is really critical. You want that shoulder of the tenon to sit perfectly on top of the jaws of the chuck. If they're not sitting on top of the jaws, or if that tenon is touching anywhere in the inside bottom of the chuck, then you've got a problem. You want the jaws to seat perfectly on the shoulder and the dovetail to grip the tenon perfectly. So I'm going to put the chuck on and then attach the bowl blank. So we've got the bowl side of the blank trued up. Now we've got to fix the tenon on the lid side. I'm going to bring the tailstock up for stability. There's still a lot of movement in this piece because of the warping. So I'm going to use the spindle detail gouge to, again, push that undercut profile for the dovetails. And then I'm going to do a push cut into the shoulder to clean up that shoulder and clear out that bottom corner. If any extra material is in that corner right there, the tenon will not seat properly in the chuck. All right, that looks pretty good. So both the tenons are trued up. Now I can part the two pieces. I needed a way to mount both the bowl and the lid to the lathe, and that's the point of cleaning up those tenons. And now that they're cleaned up, I can cut through this with a simple Japanese pull saw. I released the pressure on the tailstock there because I didn't want to bind the saw up in the piece. All right, so now we have a lid and a bowl. I'm going to start working on the bowl portion. The exterior of the bowl needs to be trued up. I'm just basically doing a simple pulling scraping cut using the lower wing of the bowl gouge. Again, this is the 1/2 inch 55-degree bevel swept back bowl gouge. I'm starting and I'm doing a grain supported cut here. If you want to know more about supported grain cuts, check out my video on which way to cut with the bowl gouge. So I'm basically moving from the base of the bowl up to the rim, so it's a supported cut. Now this is a side grain bowl blank. So I'm moving from the bottom up to the rim. And at this point I'm getting the general shape of the base of the curve of this. Now I'm going to move around to the face cut, and you can see that rim's wobbling all over because it's so warped. So I'm going to make some truing cuts here and clean up that edge and make sure we've got a good flat rim so we can start designing the bowl and the lid. All right, that seems really flat there. I'm going to go ahead and make a face cut across the surface here to smooth out the rough material. I could start removing material here, but I think I'd rather work on this rim. One of the things I'm going to do is I want the lid to seat really tight and true to the bowl. So right there I pushed in and made a slight downward angle so that when the lid seats to the bowl, they're basically going to match up right on the exterior rim, and they'll have a nice tight fit and you won't see any gap there. I'm going to get rid of some of this center material in the bowl. It's just kind of in the way at the moment. Push cuts in this situation are really nice because they allow you to keep any kind of stress off of the chuck and the tenon because you're pushing in towards the headstock. So what I need to establish here are two things. I need to establish where my wall is going to start, and I also need to make an inside groove edge for the lid to fit. So I'm going to use a parting tool so I get a really nice true flat face and 90-degree corner there for the fitted lid where that will seat. Okay, so now that that's established, now I can start working on the inside wall thickness of this bowl. I like to clear out the bowl from the rim to the bottom. A lot of people like to clear out from the center out. This gives me a lot of control, and for a couple different reasons. This bowl is relatively small, so it's not too big of an issue, and it's dry. But what happens with that center mass in the middle of the bowl as you're working, that really maintains stability of the whole piece. There's less flexing of those walls, and they stay really stable. That's a big factor when you're working with other types of bowls, such as live edge bowls or really thin greenwood bowls. And here you can see what I'm doing. I've started at the top, and I've got that inside wall thickness determined, and I'm just working down a small area. Once I have that area done, then I clear out some of the middle material that's in the way, and then work another section of the wall. Clear out some of the center material, and then work another section of the wall until I eventually make it to the bottom of the bowl. I'm using the bottom left wing to do those push cuts into the headstock and remove that center material. Now, it's a good time to stop and check the wall thickness with your fingers. You want to stop frequently and do this. And I can see right here in the middle of this bowl, there's a high spot. And I'm going to mark one edge of it and then the other edge. Between those two lines, there's a high spot that needs to come out. So I'm going to address that. And then I'm going to check it again, and I can still, it's not quite right. This piece is stable enough. I'm going to make one smooth, thin, light cut pass all the way down and just knock out that. You want to be careful with that little bit in the center. Don't force it out because you're going to pull out fibers if you do. That feels really good. So I can take the bowl out of the chuck now, and I'm going to mount the lid. I'm going to work the edge of this lid first because it's all wonky from drying, which is to be expected. Usually the pith areas of the lid or the bowl blank that's dried will push out and the side grain areas will pull in. Now what I'm doing here is I'm just making sure I don't cut that lid too small and then I've kind of messed things up. So I want to get to the point where I've got a true round piece on the lathe, but I've got enough material still to make the lid with. Now I'm using a scraping cut to start forming the top of the lid. The top of the lid and where the tenon is currently mounted will be the top of the lid, and the tenon will be removed for that. But I'm going to start making this curve just to get a feel for the shape of this bowl lid. Now we'll move around to the face. I'm going to true this up. It's just a simple push cut across the center. Clean up this surface. Now what I need to do is I need to match the lid to the groove that's in the bowl. So I'm going to use the same parting tool and cut a groove and then see how close I'm getting. Well, that's way too large. So I'm going to clear out some more material. You got to be careful doing this. You don't want to be too aggressive with it. You have to remember that everything you're doing is doubled. So if you move over 1/8 of an inch, you're taking off 1/4 of an inch on both sides, total 1/8 inch on both sides. Now that's a snug fit right there. I don't want it to be that tight, but I also don't want it to be super loose. So I'm just going to take off just a touch. Let's see how that fits. There's just a little bit of movement there. It's not gripping super hard. That's exactly what I want. Okay, so now I'm going to start removing material in the inside of the lid. You kind of got to guess a little bit here because I've got a rough idea what the outside shape of the bowl is going to be, but I'm not quite sure. I need to go back and sharpen my tool. This is the 55-degree swept back bowl gouge, and I'm going to be sharpening this using the one-way sharpening system. If you want to learn more about sharpening tools and shaping tools, check out my tool sharpening for wood bowl turning e-course. There's a description or a link in the description below, or you can go to my website, turntowoodbowl.com, and up at the top, click on courses, and you will see that tool sharpening course. In that course, I will show you how to not only sharpen, but how to shape 5 different bowl gouges, and I'll explain to you all of their purposes. And then I'll show you how to sharpen them along with all of the other tools you need to turn wood bowls. It's a great course. If you've got questions about sharpening, I highly recommend it. Okay, so I'm removing more of the material from the inside of this and really fine-tuning that inside of the lid. And again, I'm kind of guessing because there's a lot of material on the outside, so I'm not really matching anything up. The bowl still fits really nice. Everything's looking good. All right, it's time to flip this bowl over. So now I'm going to remount the bowl portion in the chuck. What I need to be doing next is shaping the top of the lid to make it conform to the rest of the bowl. So I'm going to bring the tailstock up. I'm going to center this as best I can. There's a little bit of play in the lid, but it's less than 1/16 of an inch, it's like barely 1.5 millimeters play. So I want to center this up the best I can. And now I'm going to use scraping cuts. I'm using a kind of a pull cut and a scraping cut here to start shaping the curve of the lid. What I want this bowl to do, or I want the bowl and the lid to do, is kind of come together right at the curve of the apex of the exterior of the bowl. I can tell that I've got a low spot next to the tenon in the shoulder area that I need to deal with. We've got the curve looking pretty good there. Now I'm going to use a little bit of a push cut here to shape the lid and merge it into the bowl itself. Now I'm basically doing like pulling scraping cuts. Scraping cuts are great for shaping the material gently and kind of slowly. And you can see the profile of the bowl changing here. Just making light pull cuts to make that curve really nice and fluid from top to bottom. I'm liking that. I've got some tool marks in there. Those will sand out. This is all cherry, black cherry, and it sands really well and it cleans up really well. This is kind of a moment of truth, and check how thin that lid got. Okay, it feels pretty good still. Still got plenty of meat in there, so that's good. I haven't turned through it. And there's a lot of kind of guesswork with this because you can't really measure too much. Okay, so now if you watch closely, this is 120 grit sandpaper, and this sandpaper will help me refine this curve. You can see the curve getting a little bit smoother. And now I'm moving up to 180 grit. I'm using the same sanding processes that I've shared with you in my sanding video. If you'd like to check that out, check out the sanding wood bowl video in on my channel. So I'm working through the grits all the way to 320, and then I will have this nice smooth exterior. The other nice thing about doing this with the lid fitted to the base is that seam will become almost invisible because they're being sanded together. Any high spot that was on one will basically be sanded away and merged to the other one. All right, everything's feeling really good here. All right. Now I'm going to continue sanding the inside of the bowl just to be done with that portion, so that sanding is done. I'm moving through the grits here, and I'm sparing you guys the boredom of having to watch all of that, but you get the general idea. If you want to learn more about sanding, like I said, check out my sanding video. All right, so everything's fitting together nicely. The insides are all sanded. Now we got to get rid of that ugly tenon on top of the lid. So I'm going to remount the bowl portion in the jaws. And bring that tailstock up and use pressure to hold that in place. Now the inside of that lid is relatively thin, so I don't want to apply too much pressure and push through it. That would not be good. And I'm going to use a trick here. I showed you guys this trick in my live edge bowl with the burl, the live oak burl bowl. I used it there to basically keep the burl from blowing apart on me, and it worked. So this shouldn't be a problem at all. I've got a nice clean joint, and I've got pressure on it, and it should hold together. Now, I'm also winding this up in reverse to the lathe. So if for some reason my tool were to catch the tape, it won't instantly unravel it, hopefully. The cool thing about the gaffer's tape is that it is very, very strong, but it leaves almost no residue, which is a really great aspect. I'll put a link to that in the description below. So I'm going to use push cuts here. I want as little stress and pressure on that joint from between the lid and the bowl and the tape as possible. So I'm going to use push cuts with the bottom wing or nose of the swept back bowl gouge. Again, that's the 55-degree level half-inch bowl gouge. Just going to make just light push cuts in towards the headstock, and then I'm making a scraping cut to smooth that area out just by pulling that bottom edge along the surface. You can see I have a low spot next to the tenon where the shoulder was. And I'm going to work that in just a second. Here I'm just nibbling away at that nub. Again, I'm kind of guessing. I think there's enough material there that I shouldn't be blowing through this. So I'm kind of a little bit concerned. I don't want to make a hole in the top of this lid. It'll pretty much make this whole project pointless. So I'm using the spindle detail gouge here, and then I'm switching back to the bull gouge to smooth that area out the best I can. And I'm just making really light passes to take off as little material as possible. Again, the spindle detail gouge to whittle away that nub. I'm going to make a push cut and keep that bevel nice and flush with the curve of the top of the lid until it detaches the tailstock. Now the lid is completely held on just by the gaffer's tape, and everything's looking good. So that little divot that's in there is going to sand out. Now, if you recall from my sanding video, I'm just using the right edge of the sanding foam pad here, and I'm trying to keep that in line with the grain of the wood. Now I'm going to sand with the lathe on so that the whole lid becomes nice and even, so there aren't any low spots and high spots. But then I will come back in and sand with the grain so that I remove any scratch marks when that sanding disc went against the grain surface. Now I'm going to drill a small hole that's going to receive the lid pole, or the little knob that will be on the lid. Just make a really light cut here, and I'm not making this very deep. At this point, I don't know if it's going to go through or not. It didn't go through. Okay, so that's good. If it went through, it wouldn't have been the end of the world. You'd just be able to see that on the other side, but it didn't go through, so we got lucky. So now the gaffer tape comes off, and the lid is done at this point. It's sanded inside and out, and I've got the hole drilled for the handle. That's looking good. Now it's time to finish the bowl portion. What I'm going to do here is I'm going to remove my smaller chuck and put my larger chuck in, and then I'm going to mount my jam chuck, and I'm going to reverse mount the bowl so that I can remove the tenon and shape the foot of the bowl. I'm going to bring the tailstock up to apply pressure. Now I also, besides removing the tenon, I need to finish up the shape, that exterior shape that was impossible to get to because the chuck was in the way. So I'm just using really light pull scraping cuts here to get the curve of the bowl the way I want it to appear. I'm going to use the 55-degree swept back bowl gouge to clean up that corner on the foot, and again continue to make that curve nice and smooth. And now I'm going to sand that out. I'm going to go through all the grits and sand this just like I've sanded all the other portions. I go from 120 to 180 to 240 to 320. Here I'm looking for any scratches that go against the grain and just gently rubbing those out. I'm using a smaller version of my detail spindle gouge, and I'm going to undercut into the foot of the bowl, just a nice little curved hollow portion there. And that's also going to remove the pinpoint from the tailstock quill, the live center. I'm going to cut that out. I'm going to make a push cut towards the center, and as soon as it detaches, now I just turn the lathe off. I leave the spindle gouge there to apply a little bit of pressure on there so the bowl doesn't go flying. Now that can be sanded out with a small little disc, or it can be sanded out by hand. Here I'm just going to sand this nice and smooth by hand. And we have the bowl and the lid complete at this point. Everything is looking good. Now we just need to make a little knob for the top and we'll be set. So I went digging around and I found an old piece of cherry that I used for a different project that was a cutoff, and I'm going to shape this and make it the knob. Now I also want this to be side mounted or side grain mounted. I don't want to do an end-to-end knob on a side grain bowl. So this will work out perfect. This is a little chunk of cherry that is side grain. This has a large tenon on it. I'm going to reduce this tenon so it fits in my smaller chuck. Clean up the face. I'm going to use my dividers to size that, shape it, and put a nice little dovetail undercut. And I'm going to true up that shoulder as well too. I can't stress enough the importance of getting a good tenon. Every time you make a tenon, make it the best you can, because that connection with the lathe is critical. If it's off just a little bit, it's gonna cause issues. Okay, so now I can mount this piece in the chuck. And I'm going to quickly just hog out some material because this knob is going to be relatively small. It's kind of a waste, but it's the only one that I could find, or only piece that I could find that was cherry without destroying another bowl blank, and I didn't want to do that. But I knew it was dry too. I knew I didn't want to put something in there that was green and have it warping and looking all wonky. Okay, so now I've got the material down to where I can start working with a little chunk of this. What I'm doing now is I'm basically creating a shape that mimics the bowl itself. So the bowl has a narrow base. It expands out to an apex where the seams of the bowl and the lid come together, and then the lid is relatively flat. So I'm doing the bottom of the knob right now, and I'm using my 3/8 inch bowl gouge, and this too has a 55-degree bevel that's swept back. So now you can see this is like looking at the bottom of the bowl. And it's getting really close to the shape that I'm liking. It's a design aspect is to basically mimic elements. So if you're mimicking the shape of the bowl in the knob of the bowl, visually and mentally it's satisfying or soothing, or it's at worst it's not disturbing for somebody to see that. If I were to put a round or spherical knob on this or some other shape, it might be jarring or it might look out of place. Instead, what I'm doing is I'm basically resonating the shape of the bowl in the knob itself. Here I'm just using a little bit of sandpaper to help shape that. I'm going to use a detail gouge here. Now you can use a detail gouge on side grain wood if it's for small things like this. You don't ever want to use a detail gouge for removing large amounts of material. As a matter of fact, the end grain was causing issues there, so I switched to my bowl gouge. Now you can start to see the shape of the bowl and where the top is going to be. I'm going to continue refining that shape a little bit with the sandpaper. And then I need to make the matching hole on the bottom of this knob so it can seat inside the lid. So I'm going to go through and sand the bottom of this, and this is my 180 grit. And I've went through all the different phases then. Now this bottom portion of the blank that I'm working is in the way, so I'm just going to go ahead and turn that out of the way so I can get it into the top portion of this knob. And you can see now where the flat portion is that matches the shape of the bowl. And I'm just going to carefully remove this with the detail spindle gouge. All right. As I was making this, I was wondering, I need to go see if I've got any dowel rods that I can use to put that together. And then it kind of occurred to me that, oh, dowel rods are round and I make round wooden things on the lathe. So yeah, we could probably just do that here. And then I realized there was going to be enough material with this little portion left that I could use that. And then the cool thing is this knob fits right on it there, mounted as a lathe, so that gives me the ability to sand this and round it off very nicely, as opposed to trying to do that by hand. It's such a small piece, it's really not easy to do. So I went and took the time and went through all the grits with that and got it all sanded. And then we worked that off, and then I continue working the little piece of dowel material that's going to be used to hold the knob to the lid. And I'm just going to use the parting tool to gently take that off, and I need to keep a finger on that because that thing will get lost in the shavings below. So I've got it mounted in the knob. It's too long for what I need right now, so I can actually just use a sanding disc to grind this to the proper length. And it fits. While I was making this, I thought about making the lid dark and having the knob and the bottom natural, but then it occurred to me that the bottom of the bowl is kind of in the shadows, and this particular design is like tucked under, so you really wouldn't see the natural cherry wood. So I decided to ebonize the bowl itself and the knob and leave the lid natural. And this is an ebonizing technique called iron acetate. Iron acetate reacts to the tannins in the wood and it darkens them. The cool thing about this ebonizing technique is the fact that it does not completely cover the wood and ruin all of the grain. You can still see the grain perfectly through it. Because it's a wet application, you got to let it dry a bit, and then I went back through and hand sanded some of the grain that was raised in that process. If you want to learn more about ebonizing, be sure to check out my video about ebonizing, and I've also got a great article on my website. So now I'm going to glue the knob into the lid. I'm lining up the grain in the knob to the grain on the lid. That's looking pretty good. And I'm going to use a different version of my favorite finish. This is tried and true brand Danish oil, and the Danish oil is essentially just linseed oil. My favorite finish of theirs is a linseed oil and beeswax, but because I've removed the tenons, it's going to be hard for me to buff these out later. So I prefer to use the regular oil, plus the regular Danish oil looks great on the cherry wood itself. The other cool thing is it darkens up that ebonized wood and gives it a nice rich dark appearance. Again, you can still see all of the wood grain through the ebonizing and through the oil finish. So I'm really happy with that look and the appearance of this Danish oil over the ebonized cherry. And this Danish oil can be applied multiple times. It'll build up a luster. Essentially, you just apply it, let it set for 10 or 15 minutes, and then buff off any excess oil. There's the finished bowl.
From that original roughed out cherry plank that I split in half so that it could dry with a lid and a base came this turned finished lidded bowl. I hope you've enjoyed this project as much as I have. There's lots of different turning techniques along the way, using two tenons and shaping. Basically, it's like shaping two bowls for one project, and then making a knob as a lid. And as you notice, you can see it here, I really tried to make that knob shape emulate or mirror the overall shape of the bowl and the lid. And that's just a kind of a resonating theme, and our eye finds that pleasing because we see this overall shape, and then we see this smaller shape here, and the two fit together very nicely. So let me know what you thought of this project. Leave me a comment below, I'd greatly appreciate it. Let me know if you're going to try a lidded bowl now that you've seen this video. And do me a huge favor, if you haven't already, click the like button and click the subscribe button if you're not already subscribing. I've got tons of videos in my channel, and I've got tons more videos on the way, and you're not going to want to miss any of them. I'm trying to pack each one of my videos with great information for all the turners out there, so you are inspired and motivated to go out and try something a little bit different, and just really enjoy bowl turning. That's the whole point of all of this. Until next time, as I always say, happy turning.